All equipment is breaking. Just in time for the end of the season.
That means he's a broken record of saying he's a broken record.
There's a lot of big shifts in the power rankings.
We'll try to figure this out together as a community. What's up, everybody, and welcome to a new edition of Power Rankings. It's playoffs. Some teams are eliminated. Sorry, you're not going to be in Power Rankings. But I figured I'd do a Power Rankings of the teams that actually remain. And they're all good in the league. So that's going to be a boatload of fun. I don't know how many more episodes of these we'll make. Of course, there is this upcoming week of matches. And then we have the Final Four. I might just do an episode next time around. Next time you see me talking about the Final Four and how I think those four teams will fare in the grand final event. But for now, of course, some teams have been eliminated, but we have a couple of teams left that are fighting in the lower bracket or in the winner's bracket, trying to make their way to the Final Four. So I figured I'd rank them after a weekend of playoff matches, and we'll see if you agree with me or if you disagree with me. Let me know in the comments down below, and we'll try to figure this out together as a community. Let's kick things off with APAC, and I don't think it's a big surprise to anyone that Shanghai Dragons, of course, still remain number one, looking as impressive as ever, and this is a meta that is sort of catering to them. After all, Lip can play that Sombra, and they're looking really good for the most part playing these compositions. Fled on the Tracer as well, went head-to-head against SBB. He had some disappointing moments on the Tracer, but also some great moments on that Tracer, especially on Lijiang Tower. So things are looking good for the Shanghai Dragons once more, and they still remain the favorites in my mind to really win the entire thing this year. Now, for second place in the APAC region, I've decided to go with the Seoul Dynasty because they're playing a bit of a wacky composition. It's a bit eerily similar to the Washington Justice, except instead of a Zarya, they like to play the Sigma. So there's a lot of Gesture, Roadhog, and Marvel Sigma action going on in the APAC region with Seoul Dynasty, but they're looking really good doing so. I think a lot of teams were caught off guard by this type of composition, and they don't really know how to deal with it. Specifically in the APAC region, we saw ourselves Guangzhou just being dominated by Seoul Dynasty's sheer power here. So that is a big concern for the rest of the APAC teams. How will you really deal with the Seoul Dynasty? I wonder if the Seoul Dynasty can translate that more into other types of compositions. For example, we know that Prophet, he is good on so many different heroes. He spent some time on Pharah this past week. But if he can get on the Tracer and actually start winning some Tracer head-to-head duels, that bodes very well for the Seoul Dynasty as well, going up against some of these teams that might be struggling with the meta. But Seoul Dynasty remain at number 2 for the time being, because I think that they play a bit of a unique composition, and it's going to be hard for the rest of APAC to really adapt and deal with that. We'll have to see if they can take them down. At number 3, we have the New York Excelsior. I don't think this is a big surprise to anyone. Obviously, New York Excelsior is still a great team. They had some wacky hero compositions. If you've been watching Sideshow's stream where he reviewed some of these games, he liked to point out a broken record. He even said it was a broken record 3 times. That means he's a broken record of saying he's a broken record. About how Jonak just wouldn't flex over to the Moira, and the New York Excelsior had sometimes difficulties adapting to the most optimal compositions in the moment, and they prefer to stick on their favorite heroes when it comes to their own individual strength. That is a bit concerning going up against some of the other teams, specifically against Seoul Dynasty, right? Because they play such a wacky composition. Can New York Excelsior adapt and really take that down? That is going to be a big question mark for me about the New York Excelsior moving into these last couple of playoff matches before the Final Four. When it comes to their individual heroes, though, I mean, I think SBB is having a bit of a resurgence on this Tracer. Not that he was ever bad at it, but he hasn't spent so much time on the Tracer this year. So I really appreciate that he's come into some of these games and really took it to the Shanghai Dragons, and he's looking really good on that Tracer. That is a big boon for this New York Excelsior team that is also adapting to Haksal Sombra and what that might bring to the table. So I'm liking what I'm seeing from the New York Excelsior. I think they're a really good team. I would probably have put them at number 2 if it wasn't for the fact that Seoul plays such a wacky composition that could be hard to adapt to. I think if these two teams were to play head-to-head, I think Seoul Dynasty would come out on top, because I don't think that New York Excelsior would make the adaptations necessary to deal with Seoul. So that's why I put Seoul at number 2. Now, number 4, of course, Guangzhou. not really putting forth their best gameplay. Obviously, they took down the Shanghai Dragons in the Summer Showdown, and a lot of people have very high expectations for this team, but it just doesn't look like they've come into this meta and look very comfortable. They had some wacky compositions. Pharaoh and King's Row is questionable. I think you can make it work, specifically in the right hands of a good player, but they just weren't able to deal with Seoul Dynasty at all, and that is a bit worrying going into some of these remaining playoff matches for Guangzhou. But you know, we know they're a great team. We know they have a great personnel. Can they make it work moving forward? Maybe, but for now they are number 4 in my APAC power rankings. Moving over to North America. Now this is quite interesting because we have a lot of big upsets here. There's a lot of big shifts in the power rankings. Obviously, a lot of teams have just been eliminated, so I won't be featuring those. So stay tuned for the offseason and you might see some changes with those teams. But let's move on to the teams that remain in the playoffs. Number 1, the Philadelphia Fusion. Okay, San Francisco Shock, they struggle a bit against the Washington Justice, which is understandable because Washington Justice have just been so ridiculously dominant with Decay on that Zarya. But the Fusion have looked stellar so far in the playoffs, obviously catering a lot to this Sombra and Reaper composition, where Hisu on this Sombra is really starting to pop off and making a name for himself. We know he was a very good player going into this season, but now he is really having his moment in my mind on this Sombra, and it's a big difference maker when Fusion go up against the likes of Gladiators and go up against the likes of Valiant, and they're really proving a point here that they are a team you should be really scared of. Of course, they have a ton of flexibility in this roster as well, so they don't only strictly have to stay to this Sombra composition with the Reaper or maybe moving over to a Tracer. I think Fusion could come up with a lot of wacky strats themselves and maybe ultimately end up being the team that counters the Justice and their star comp. We'll have to see, but I do put my faith in the Fusion so far. They look really good, really crisp. Clutch moments, of course, as well. They bring back fights, they make it hard for the other team. Really like what I'm seeing from the Fusion so far, so they are number 1. At number 2, we have the San Francisco Shock, obviously moving down a spot from last week. I thought Shock was the big favorite going into the playoffs, but of course they struggled a little bit against the Justice. Obviously it reverse swept them, so you have to give some credit for Shock for pulling off that reverse sweep. It's very difficult to do so, but they were able to make the changes necessary. Striker on the Tracer is just absurd, and it's of course going to be a big factor moving forward as well. If you can get Striker on that Tracer role permanently against the likes of Fusion, that is going to be a big game changer for the Shock, so I'm looking forward to see more of that. Maybe as well if you can get Ans to play on the Ashe as well. I know Ans had some moments on Sombra this past week, but I think Ashe and Widowmaker is really An's favorite heroes. Widowmaker is harder to pull off in this meta, in my opinion, but if you can move him over to the Ashe and then at the Tracer, this is what I talked about last week a lot. You know, if you watched last week's episode, you would know that I spent a lot of time talking about Ashe Tracer being the meta. Now, it doesn't seem like Ashe Tracer is the best composition moving forward, but if you could get the Shock to play those two heroes, that would be a big boon for that team. So we'll have to stay tuned and see what the Shock bring out, but they are number 2 for now. We know they have a great skill. If they can just iron out like a few things, add like 5 or 10% to their performance, I do think that they could beat out the Fusion this upcoming week. But for now, I'm favoring the Fusion. At number 3, of course, we have the Washington Justice. Big surprise to everyone that this team just went rampant in the playoffs. Of course, we knew that Decay was going to be a great addition to the team, but maybe not in this fashion, okay? A lot of people just assumed Decay is going to be on the damage roll and replace either Stitch or Tuba, but now playing the Zarya and Janu as a tank comrade on that Roadhog, I mean, this team is almost looking like... No, I'm not gonna say they're stacked. They're not stacked, but they're looking really good individually. I think everyone is shining on their specific roles. Obviously, I interviewed Ark this past week as well, and he spoke to me about how the fact that they're so confident now because all of these players on the Washington Justice play comfort heroes, and they feel so much better about that. So that is really helping them out in some of their decision making and proactive gameplay. Aim God, of course, I think his Ana was really good this past week because you saw, if you watch Aim God, take a look at his reactive nano boosts. He's really good at saving teammates in the middle of fights with those nano boosts, and he's making a big difference. So shout out to Aim God for that. And of course, Ark, his best hero is the Mercy in my mind, and now he's able to play that Mercy, so that is making a big impact as well. And with Decay on the Zarya, that allows Stitch to play the Ashe and just have a great impact as well. So I'm really liking what I'm seeing from this team. If there's any improvements I would like to see being made, it's Tuba Sombra. If Tuba can step up the Sombra just a little bit, I think that could could be another great piece for this team. Moving on to the Los Angeles Valiant, I'm not going to spend too much time on these remaining teams, but of course the Valiant beat out the Florida Mayhem playing the Sombra Reaper composition. KSP didn't have the cleanest Sombra, but it was enough to really pull this team ahead. I still think that this is a team that impressed me specifically because they made a lot of good decisions in the team fights. I think that Dreamer and McGravy in the Valiant, they really coordinated these great engagement and also peeled back and allowed their damage players to succeed. So happily surprised by the Valiant, of course, beating out the Florida Mayhem. It is a bit concerning with the Florida Mayhem, with them moving forward and them doing the switch between BQB and Yaki. I think Yaki on the Sombra is a big upgrade for this team, and that might mean that Florida Mayhem is the better team. They are better than the Valiant. But of course, because Valiant won that match, don't want to take things out in advance. I don't want to discredit Valiant for getting that win against the Mayhem, but the Mayhem with Yaki on Sombra are looking super crisp, and just the fashion in which they played when Yaki was on that Sombra, and they were able to make some good swaps as well. Yaki played the Genji on Dorado. That is going to be a big changer going into this next week as well, to the point where I think the Florida Mayhem still have that like underdog title where they could upset some of these teams and maybe even make it to the Final Four. That is obviously going to be very tough with the likes of Shock and Fusion in the mix, but if you have to name one team, the Florida Mayhem, I don't think you should sleep on them at all because they're looking really good. Finally, we have the Atlanta Reign. Now, this is a team that, in my mind, of the remaining teams, look the most uncomfortable. Obviously, they've made it work, and Sharp on that Sombra as well as the Ash has come into this team and provided a lot in terms of that hit scan role. But still, they look a bit uncomfortable. They don't have the same clean gameplay that some of these other teams have. Gate Rebel playing some more Reinhardt, and they're trying to make this brawl work. But I don't think it's really enough to get more wins in the remainder of the playoffs. So, the Atlanta Reign, it's a team that are perhaps a bit underestimated at this point, but I'm not going to make any bets on them winning anytime soon. That being said, big props for actually making it this deep in the playoffs. I think going into the playoffs, a lot of teams hesitated to talk about the Atlanta Reign, and, you know, considering them, given they've been pretty disappointing this season, I'd say, so far, because they came in with so much potential. But now, in the playoffs, I mean, they are part of the final 6 teams here in North America, and you have to give them credit for that. They've actually managed to make things work in a new meta. They brought in Sharp. They're willing to make the adjustments necessary to get the wins, and so you have to give the Atlanta Reign credit for that. And, you know, it's going to be interesting to follow them going up against the Washington Justice next week. Now, that is my power rankings for this week. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Let me know down in the comments down below if you agree or disagree, if you would like to make any changes. Don't forget to subscribe to the Overwatch League YouTube channel as well, and I might see you for a new episode with the final 4 teams once the playoffs is all but over. So stay tuned, everyone. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next time here on the Overwatch League YouTube channel. Take care.